Hi everyone, I hope you all had a fantastic weekend. I'm Eva, and today with me, June, Salam, and Christian will be presenting on realist evaluation. Realist evaluation is a theory-based approach, which asks how and why do intervention work or not work, for whom and in what circumstances. Let's start with some historical context about the realist evaluation approach. The realist evaluation approach was based on neorealism and integration of lessons drawn by many evaluators from practice, theory, and research. It assumes that reality exists apart from our understanding of it. However, there are regular patterns in the world that we can somehow detect and recognize. Humans have evolved sense-making capabilities to explore and understand the world. Although the sense-making capability are adaptive, flaws remain in practices. Therefore, socially constructed sense-making technology were innovated and designed to supplement the biological processes. For instance, we can use a hearing aid to hear falling trees better, conduct an experiment to better estimate some intervention's effect. Evaluation is deconstructed technology to help to make sense of social programs. The emergent realist evaluation approach focuses on both sense-making and valuing. Before emergent realist evaluation, most realists emphasize only in sense-making. For example, Campbell stresses the use of techniques designed to estimate the impact of programs. In contrast, some theorists, such as Guba and Lincoln, focus more on addressing programs' value issues. An evaluation of a social program or policy can rarely measure all of the possible consequences. An evaluation will legitimate those values by measuring the outcomes related to some group's value position while giving a short shrift to others. Realist evaluators recognize that different individuals and groups assign varying levels of importance to different values and that choices made in the evaluation process can serve some values perspective. Also, realist evaluators believe that the value positions surrounding social programs can and should be directly studied. Realist evaluation to date has given general priority to explanation, including identification of the manipulable generative mechanism that underlie program effects and the conditions under which these mechanisms operate, including the types of individual for whom they worked. The realist evaluation approach serves three main functions of evaluations, which is formative, summative, and knowledge construction. Therefore, a focus on underlying generative mechanism aids formative purposes by providing a basis for strengthening an intervention, making it more efficient, better targeting those who will be most helped, and designing a future intervention. All of these decision-making steps will be easier if we understand why a program works. Learning about underlying mechanisms also serves traditional objectives of summative evaluations. It is a valuable basis for generalizations about the program's likely effectiveness for other persons, settings, or times. In addition, studying underlying mechanisms requires assessing the effect of a program, usually on multiple outcomes. Thus, the evaluator using the realism evaluation approach also typically provide information about a program's merit or worth. And now Salam will talk about where on the evaluation landscape does the realist evaluation approach sit.
Thank you, Eva, for the overview. We're going to look at a little bit more in depth into realist evaluation, and a key point is to look at the type of question that realist evaluation seeks to answer. For example, a traditional experiment or evaluation asks the question, does this work or what works? In contrast, a realist evaluation asks the question, what works, for whom, in what circumstances, and why? The realist evaluation approach is opposed to the two traditional ontologies, the positivist experimentalist view that only what can be known is based on direct observation. It also opposes the constructivist view that everything is contingent, that there are no possible regularities. Realist evaluation takes a third option that assumes the existence of demi-regularities, this finding of a middle ground. As Eva mentioned, the underlying mechanisms is a central concept in realist evaluation, and Pawson provides various definitions of mechanism in his early and then later works. However, the effort to identify mechanisms by which programs work does predate Pawson's and Tilley's 1997 book, Realist Evaluation, where the approach was conceptualized. You can look back to the work done by Chen and Rossi in 1987 and 1990 that represents the first usage of the term mechanism as a means of opening up the black box of evaluation. This idea of explaining the reasons why program causes particular outcomes. Going back further, we can look at the work of Carol Weiss in the 1970s in addressing the role of theory as a strategy to explain why policy programs worked or did not. Yet it was not until Pawson and Tilley's work that a systematic discussion of mechanisms were seen in the context of applied research and evaluation. What differentiates realist evaluations from other theory-based schools of evaluation is its focus on three important elements: context, mechanism, and outcome. Realist evaluation is about hypothesizing and testing different configurations of these three elements. For example, what happens to the outcome if the mechanism, let's say treatment or intervention, increases or decreases? What happens to outcome as a function of changes to context? In many ways, realist evaluators work as theorists, formulating hypotheses using these three elements. In this updated 2012 evaluation theory tree that incorporates North American, European, and Australian theorists, we're able to see where realist evaluation sits on the theory tree. You find Pawson and Tilley, as expected, squarely on the methods branch. This approach became very popular in Europe as evaluation expanded into various policy domains, in particular health policy, and is considered the European version of theory-driven evaluation. And it was further adopted in the US by Henry and Mark into the emergent realist evaluation approach. The popularity of realist evaluation is largely attributed to its usefulness in complex systems. As a realist evaluation approach responded to the challenges of complexity. Pawson, in his 2013 book, argues against the practice within evaluation of starting each inquiry from scratch in silo. He argues that this does not take into consideration the complexity problem, that each program is a complex system, often inserted into yet another complex system, and that is what makes it difficult for evaluators. Those one-off evaluations will always fall short and be open to criticism. Instead, Pawson argues for a focus on program theory to help produce significant enlargement of the scope of evaluative inquiry. In other words, to move from the tree to the forest by the use of two different modes. The first mode he terms from one to the many. He considers one strategy, such as the use of systematic review or meta-analysis, acknowledging the important gains that can be learned by looking at the same, quotes, program theory as carried out in different trials, on different occasions, and in different populations. The other important mode is termed from the one to the generic. The basic idea of battling complexity by testing out policy ideas in an ever-widening array of conditions and domain. Program theory becomes a unit of analysis and makes it easily portable to other domains. I will now turn over my presentation to my colleague June, who will give us an overview on how to conduct realist evaluation.
Thanks, Alan, for that excellent discussion about the theories and concepts behind realist evaluation. And to take one step further, I will now discuss on how realist evaluation is conducted. In general, there are four basic steps involved in realist evaluation. The first one is to develop the initial program theory, which describes how the intervention is expected to lead to its effects and in which conditions it should do so, by identifying the mechanisms that generate those outcomes. Remember that in realist evaluation, it starts with theory and ends with theory. The purpose is to test and refine the initial program theory and to determine whether and how the program works in a particular setting or context. However, realist evaluation specifies what mechanisms will generate the outcomes and what features of the context will affect whether or not those mechanisms operate, which is now known as the CMO model, which Salam earlier discussed with us already. The second step is to choose the evaluation methods. Fortunately, realist evaluation is methods neutral. That is, the choice of data collection and the analysis methods and tools should be guided by the types of data that are needed to answer the evaluation questions, or more specifically, to test the initial program theory in all its dimensions. Having said that, most realist evaluation do use mixed methods in analyzing data. Specifically, quantitative tools are focused on context and outcomes, while qualitative tools are focused on the generative mechanisms. In realist evaluation, there is no need for comparison groups because in realist evaluation uses intra-program comparisons. That is, the refined program theory is tested in subsequent study in a different context and then further refined and then tested again until we arrive at the most robust program theory. And this is normally done through case study method, whereby the case selection is typically purposive as the cases should enable testing of the initial program theory in all its dimensions. The next step is to analyze the data collected. And as you probably realized already, realist evaluation uses realism principle. Realist evaluation explains change brought about by an intervention by referring to the actors who act and change or not, a situation under specific conditions and under the influence of external events. The actors and the interventions are considered to be embedded in a social reality that influences, how the intervention is implemented and how the actors respond to it or not. As such, the CMO configuration is really the main structure for realist analysis. And so what are the steps involved in realist evaluation data analysis? First is to organize the data to relate to what was done or to context, the mechanism, outcome, and the actors. The second is qualitative data are coded and then appropriate methods for analyzing quantitative data are applied. The data on outcomes are then disaggregated by subgroups. And once patterns of these outcomes are identified, the mechanisms generating those outcomes can be analyzed, provided the right kinds of data are available. The context in which particular mechanisms did or did not fire can then be determined. And this may include organizational, socioeconomic, cultural, and political conditions. It is important to note that the analytic process is not necessarily sequential, but should result in a set of context, mechanism, outcome statements. For example, in this context, that particular mechanism fired for these actors, generating those outcomes. In that context, this mechanism fired, generating these different outcomes. And so the last phase of the analysis consists of determining which CMO configurations offer the most robust and plausible explanation of the observed pattern of outcomes. These resulting CMO configuration is then compared with the initial program theory, which is then modified or not in light of the evaluation findings. Which leads us to the fourth step, or the final step, is to use the findings and revise the initial program theory if necessary. So both generative mechanisms and program theories can be considered at different levels of abstraction, from the very specific to quite abstract. Therefore, in realist evaluation, the middle range theories, is most useful. Middle MRT is basically the middle ground, between the most, between the minor but necessary working hypothesis and all the inclusive systematic efforts to develop a unified theory that will explain all the observed uniformities of social behavior, social organization, social change. MRTs are very useful because they are specific enough to generate particular propositions to test and general enough to apply across different situations. MRTs also are developed over time based on the accumulation of insights acquired through a series of studies, allowing gradual specification of the realist findings. And all kinds of theory in realist evaluation are most useful if developed at the middle level of abstraction. Realist evaluation uses the idea of generative causality, meaning mechanisms only work when the context is conducive. As a result, realist evaluations are modest in their claims, stating that an evaluation cannot produce universally applicable findings. At best, realist evaluation can make sense of the complex processes underlying programs by formulating a possible explanations ex post or after the fact. That is, it can indicate the conditions in which the intervention works or not and how they do so. This realistic specification allows decision makers to assess whether interventions that prove successful in one setting may be so in another setting, and therefore assist program planners in adapting interventions to suit a specific context. In short, if there's one thing that we would really like you to take away from this presentation is that in realist evaluation, context really matters. So for more information in using realist evaluation, my teammate Christian will discuss with you some of the tips and the traps in using realist evaluation.
Thank you, June. So first I'm going to speak about tips for an effective realist evaluation. So the first tip, a realist evaluation is useful when the evaluation's purpose is to inform policies, program decisions, and implementation practices. Now, most evaluations will meet at least one of these purposes, so it's generally a realist evaluation is suitable in most circumstances. However, there is an important factor to note, and this brings us to tip number 2. So a realist evaluation is well suited for discovering causal mechanisms, especially in complex situations. To review, a mechanism is what makes a program work. Ray Pawson believes that the why question is prior to the does it work question. And to help answer this question, realist evaluations use at least 3 forms of evidence: quantitative, qualitative, and comparative evidence. Occasionally, narrative evidence is also used to discover causal mechanisms. Now, with this being said, there are situations where stakeholders are primarily concerned in determining whether a program works instead of why or how it works. And a realist evaluation may not be as practical or feasible in these situations. Now, tip number 3 is to invest time in understanding the intervention and its context. So it is impossible to develop nuanced theories about how or why a program works without a clear understanding of how it is implemented. So narrative evidence can be useful when trying to understand the for whom and under what circumstances questions. So you don't want to begin developing theory too early because you might miss an important contextual factor. Tip number 4 is to perform a substantive literature review early in the evaluation process. So a lit review will help save time when trying to identify possible mechanisms. It can also identify possible mechanisms that aren't obvious or are initially missed. Tip number 5 is to engage with stakeholders when developing program theory. Now this helps evaluators focus on issues that are a priority for both policymakers and implementers, and it increases the likelihood that the evaluation's findings will be used. And the last tip is to be flexible. Context matters, but it also continually changes. Therefore, we need to be ready to change plans and have a process in place to deal with change. So next I will speak about traps when using a realist evaluation. And so the first trap is that they are very complex and intellectually challenging. And so this comes from Ray Pawson and Nick Tilley themselves. So I just want to read a quote from them that talks about this trap. Realist evaluation requires sustained thinking and imagination to work through program theory, to define expected outcome patterns, and to figure out exactly what to look for and where to find it. None of this is easy. It requires advanced theoretical understanding, abilities to design research, and techniques for data analysis. So as you can see, this does sound like it's very complex and intellectually challenging. So the trap number 2 is that findings are tentative and not comprehensive. So all we can ever have is partial knowledge. So the findings of an evaluation are specific to this program, implemented in this manner, and implemented by this group of people, and with these groups as beneficiaries. Additionally, the programs change the conditions that make them work, and this may increase or decrease the program's effectiveness over time. The third trap is that the utility of an evaluation greatly rests on the validity of CMO or CMO statements. So an evaluator really has to get the CMO models quote unquote right and correctly determine the CMO that offers the most robust and plausible explanation of the observed pattern of outcomes. So if a mistake is made during this stage, then the findings come under increased scrutiny and may end up being invalidated. So you can see how much rests on the CMO statements. And the last trap is that a realist evaluation is time sensitive if done right. So if this process makes your brain hurt, then you're not alone. So while a realist evaluation is not inherently more time intensive than other approaches, if you want to really get to the nitty gritty and find out the truth, then in practice, evaluators have to spend a lot of time on each of these steps in order to make the best informed decisions and provide relevant and useful findings.